It wasn't intentional. The device malfunctioned. I never meant to record anyone here.
This is the moment a former police officer destroyed his entire career. On camera. Not during a high-speed chase. Not in a dark interrogation room. But sitting calmly in a courtroom under bright lights in front of millions of viewers, believing he was the smartest person in the room. A man who spent years enforcing the law decided, in a single reckless move, that the rules no longer applied to him. And what followed became one of the most shocking courtroom implosions in television history. Because this wasn't just any defendant. This was a man trained to uphold the law, sworn to protect it, someone who once testified against others for doing exactly what he was about to do himself. Instead of respecting the courtroom, instead of trusting the truth, he chose deception. He chose secrecy. He chose to break the very rules he once arrested people for breaking. And the moment he made that choice, his fate was sealed, even if he didn't realize it yet. What makes this story unforgettable is the irony. He believed he was being clever. He believed he was gathering leverage. He believed he was walking into court with a hidden advantage that would protect him if things didn't go his way. In his mind, he wasn't committing a crime, he was covering himself. But what he didn't understand was this. When you try to outsmart the system using the same tricks you once warned others about, you don't expose corruption. You expose yourself. And there was something else he didn't account for. Something small. Something silent. Something hidden where no one thought to look. Not visible to the audience. Not obvious to the court staff. And certainly not something he ever expected to turn against him. While he sat there, confident and composed, that hidden detail was already recording more than he planned. Moments, intentions, and statements that would later become impossible to explain away. Because the footage he thought would protect him didn't just capture the case. It captured him. His mindset. His arrogance. His intent. And once that footage surfaced, it didn't stay confined to one courtroom. It was reviewed. It was examined. And eventually, it was used in multiple investigations that reached far beyond that single day in court. And at the center of it all stood Judge Judy, someone who has built an entire career on recognizing lies before they're spoken, and arrogance before it explodes. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Because sometimes the most devastating justice comes not from what a judge says, but from what someone foolishly records for themselves. If you believe no one is above the law, not even those who once enforced it, hit like before we expose exactly how this former officer captured the evidence that ended his own career. His name was Daniel Mercer. 46 years old. Former patrol sergeant with just over 19 years on the force. And from the moment he walked into the courtroom, it was obvious he didn't see himself as an ordinary defendant. He carried himself the way men do when they've spent decades being obeyed, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised, eyes scanning the room as if assessing a threat. This wasn't nervousness. This was ownership. In his mind, courtrooms weren't places where he was judged. They were places where he performed. Daniel had built his entire identity around one thing, the badge he no longer wore. He referenced his service the way others reference credentials from elite universities. 19 years of protecting the public. Hundreds of arrests. Dozens of courtroom testimonies. He spoke about his past not with pride but with expectation. The expectation that it should still carry weight, that it should still open doors, that it should still bend outcomes in his favor. To Daniel, experience wasn't just history. It was a weapon. From the very first exchange, he made it clear he believed he understood the system better than anyone else in the room. He used phrases that sounded harmless on the surface but carried a sharp edge underneath. I know how the system works. I've testified in courtrooms like this. I've seen how these cases usually go. Each sentence wasn't meant to inform, it was meant to remind everyone that he wasn't like the other people who sat at that podium. He wasn't a civilian. He was a former insider. And that distinction mattered deeply to him. Daniel didn't look at the bench with the quiet respect most defendants showed. He looked at it the way someone looks at a television screen. In his mind, this wasn't a courtroom, it was a set. And the person presiding over it wasn't authority, just a personality. A show. A familiar face he'd seen countless times, never imagining he'd be on the opposite side of her questions. Because to Daniel Mercer, badges ranked higher than gavels. Street experience ranked higher than courtroom rules. And reputation, especially a reputation built in uniform, meant immunity. He believed that once you've worn the badge long enough, the system remembers you, protects you, gives you the benefit of the doubt. That belief wasn't arrogance born overnight. It was cultivated over years of doors opening, questions stopping, and consequences softening the moment he identified himself as law enforcement. The reason he was in court only reinforced that mindset. This wasn't a violent crime. This wasn't anything that felt serious to him. It was a civil dispute, a harassment and retaliation claim brought by a former neighbor who accused Daniel of intimidation after a long-running property conflict. The neighbor claimed Daniel used his law enforcement background to threaten, pressure, and intimidate him into dropping complaints. Daniel dismissed it as nonsense. A misunderstanding. Overblown. Someone trying to play the victim. In his version of events, he wasn't the aggressor. He was the professional. The calm one. The one who knew exactly how far he could go without crossing a line. And that's what made him dangerous to himself. Because Daniel didn't think rules applied to him the same way they applied to everyone else. Rules were for people who didn't understand the gray areas. He lived in those gray areas. Or at least he thought he did. Every answer he gave was polished. Controlled. Delivered with the confidence of someone who had coached witnesses instead of being one. He corrected wording. Clarified questions that didn't need clarification. Smiled faintly when legal terms were used, as if he already knew where the conversation was headed. To him, this wasn't a trial. It was a formality. A box to check before walking out vindicated. What Daniel never questioned, not for a single moment, was whether his confidence might be misplaced. He never asked himself if the habits that protected him on the street could betray him in a courtroom. He never considered that the very instincts that once made him effective as a cop could now be read as manipulation. And he certainly never imagined that his belief in his own immunity was about to be tested by someone who had dismantled far more powerful egos than his. Because sitting across from him wasn't just a television judge. It was Judge Judy, someone who had spent decades listening to men exactly like Daniel explain why the rules shouldn't apply to them. Men who mistook familiarity for superiority. Men who believed experience excused behavior. Men who walked and convinced the system still belonged to them. Daniel Mercer thought he was untouchable. He thought his past would shield him. He thought his confidence would carry him through. And that belief, more than anything else, is what set the stage for everything that followed. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic accusation, no raised voice, no sudden interruption. What happened instead was far more dangerous. A quiet shift in attention. Judge Judy had seen thousands of defendants sit where Daniel Mercer sat. Nervous ones. Angry ones. Guilty ones. Innocent ones. And what caught her attention wasn't what he was saying, it was how his body refused to relax, even when the questions were simple. Daniel leaned forward slightly in his chair, but not in a way that suggested engagement. It was controlled. Calculated. His shoulders were tight. His torso angled just enough to one side to look comfortable while actually being rigid. To the untrained eye, it meant nothing. To someone who had spent decades watching people under pressure, it was the posture of someone managing something, not listening. Then there were his eyes. Not darting. Not panicked. Just drifting downward again and again, like a reflex he didn't realize he was repeating. Each glance was quick, almost subconscious, but consistent. Down. Back up. Down again. Not toward his paperwork. Not toward the opposing party. Toward the same unseen point every time. It was the kind of movement people make when they're checking something they don't want anyone else to notice. And his hands never fully stopped moving. They weren't shaking, that would have been too obvious. Instead they adjusted. Straightened. Pressed lightly against the table, then pulled back. Fingers touched together, separated, touched again. It looked like composure, but it wasn't. It was control under strain. The kind of micro-movement people make when they're holding something in place mentally and physically at the same time. Judge Judy didn't interrupt him immediately. She let him talk. She let him settle into his rhythm. And then, casually, she asked a question that had nothing to do with the case. Why are you leaning like that? The room went quiet in the way courtrooms do when something unexpected happens. Daniel blinked just once. Not long enough to draw attention. Long enough to recalibrate. He smiled faintly and shifted slightly, as if the question were mildly amusing. Oh, force of habit, he said smoothly. Years of sitting in briefing rooms and patrol cars. Bad posture, I guess. It was a reasonable answer. Too reasonable. Delivered without hesitation, without emotion, like a line he'd practiced his entire career. Judge Judy nodded, but her eyes didn't soften. Instead, she waited a beat longer than necessary. Long enough for Daniel to feel the silence. "You seem very tense for someone with nothing to hide," she said. There was no accusation in her voice. No judgment. Just observation. Daniel didn't respond like an innocent man surprised by the implication. He responded like a witness on the stand. He straightened further, squared his shoulders, and shifted into explanation mode. "Well, Your Honor, with all due respect, courtrooms are stressful environments," he began. "Even for people familiar with legal proceedings. Especially when there are allegations that mischaracterize intent. Mischaracterize intent. Legal phrasing. Defensive without sounding defensive." He went on, elaborating on stress responses, procedural misunderstandings, and how civil disputes often escalated emotionally. He wasn't answering her question, he was redefining it. As he spoke, he corrected small details that didn't need correction. Clarified timelines no one had challenged. Explained processes no one had asked about. Each clarification wasn't about accuracy. It was about control. About steering the conversation back into territory he understood. Territory where he felt superior. Judge Judy let him finish. She didn't interrupt. She didn't challenge him immediately. Instead, she asked another small question, one that sounded harmless. "You've testified in court before, haven't you?" Daniel's face lit with recognition. This was familiar ground. "Yes, Your Honor. Numerous times. Criminal cases, civil hearings, internal reviews." "And in those courtrooms," she continued evenly, "did you find yourself this uncomfortable?" Daniel paused. Just a fraction of a second. Then he smiled again. "Well, those were different circumstances," he said. "I was there in a professional capacity." There it was. The hierarchy. The distinction he couldn't stop reinforcing. Professional then. Defendant now. The implication was clear. Discomfort wasn't about guilt, it was about status. About being forced into a role he believed he shouldn't occupy. Judge Judy leaned back slightly, folding her hands. Her face revealed nothing. But inside the picture was forming. The posture. The glances. The constant adjustments. The over-explaining. The way Daniel answered questions that hadn't been asked and avoided the ones that mattered. This wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. And it certainly wasn't respect. It was calculation. And calculation in a courtroom is often more revealing than panic. Daniel Mercer thought he was staying ahead of the conversation. He believed his composure, his experience, his vocabulary were insulating him from scrutiny. What he didn't realize was that every controlled movement, every unnecessary explanation, every downward glance was narrowing the focus. Not on the case itself, but on him. And once a judge like Judy starts watching how you behave instead of what you say, the outcome is no longer about evidence alone. It becomes about intent. And intent has a way of surfacing, even before proof does. The shift from tension to confrontation was subtle, but unmistakable. Daniel Mercer stopped answering questions the way a defendant would and began speaking the way an instructor does, measured, confident, and faintly condescending. His tone didn't rise. His words didn't sharpen. Instead, he wrapped his challenge in professionalism, the way men do when they want to assert dominance without appearing disrespectful. "In real courtrooms," he said at one point, "we handled situations like this very differently." It wasn't a throwaway comment. It was a comparison. And comparisons in a courtroom are rarely accidental. Daniel wasn't just describing his experience. He was positioning it above the room he was currently standing in. The implication hung in the air. This wasn't a real courtroom to him. This was something else. Something lesser. A few minutes later he did it again. "That's not how we did it in my department," he said, shaking his head slightly as if correcting a junior officer. There was no aggression in his voice, but there was certainty. The kind that assumes authority without asking for it. To Daniel, the badge he once wore still mattered more than the bench in front of him. He believed his past role gave him the right to redefine the present. He didn't stop there. As the questioning continued, Daniel began framing Judge Judy's inquiries as subjective rather than procedural. "With respect," he said, "this feels more interpretive than evidentiary." Another time he remarked that televised courtrooms sometimes prioritize presentation over process. Presentation over process. The room absorbed the comment before anyone reacted. Daniel may not have realized it, but he had crossed a line, not by being loud or defiant, but by questioning the legitimacy of the authority presiding over him. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was subtly discrediting the court itself. Judge Judy didn't interrupt. She didn't bristle. She didn't correct him. She went very still. Her response was calm, unnervingly so. She let him finish each sentence even when he rambled. She nodded once or twice, not in agreement but in acknowledgement. And when she spoke, her voice was even, almost conversational. "You seem very certain about how things should be handled," she said. Daniel smiled. "Experience tends to do that." It was meant to sound humble. It didn't. "You're implying," she continued, "that this court operates differently than the ones you're accustomed to." "I'm just saying," Daniel replied, "that procedures exist for a reason. And sometimes theatrics can blur that line." The word lingered, theatrics. Carefully chosen. Calculated. A suggestion that what was happening wasn't purely about justice. That it was influenced by spectacle. That it wasn't as serious as the courtrooms he respected. Judge Judy didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. Instead, she asked a question that seemed almost unrelated. "And you're very familiar with courtroom procedures, correct?" "Yes," Daniel said quickly. "Extensively." "And recording laws?" she asked. Daniel answered without hesitation. "Of course." The speed of his response was telling. Too fast. Too confident. He launched into an explanation of consent statutes, one-party versus two-party laws, and the nuances of evidentiary admissibility. It was impressive, thorough, articulate, and completely unnecessary. Because no one had asked him to explain any of that. Judge Judy watched him talk himself deeper into familiarity, into expertise, into assumptions. And then mid-sentence, Daniel made a mistake so small he didn't even realize it had happened. "Well, obviously," he said, "if something were being recorded without consent in a courtroom like this, it would." He stopped. Not because he'd been interrupted. Not because someone objected. But because the room had gone silent in a way that wasn't normal. The kind of silence that feels heavy. Expectant. Judge Judy tilted her head slightly. "Why would you say, if something were being recorded?" Daniel hesitated. Just long enough. "I was speaking hypothetically," he said quickly. "In general terms." Judge Judy nodded slowly. "Interesting," she said. "Because no one here mentioned recording." Daniel's smile tightened. His shoulders stiffened. The calm confidence he'd maintained began to show hairline fractures. He tried to recover, adding unnecessary clarification, explaining that his background made him think ahead, anticipate scenarios, consider possibilities. But the damage was done. He had revealed awareness of a concern that hadn't been raised. Knowledge of a risk that hadn't been discussed. He'd exposed a mindset that assumed surveillance before it was ever acknowledged. Judge Judy didn't accuse him. She didn't confront him. She simply moved on, which was far more unsettling. Because when a judge like Judge Judy stops pushing and starts observing, it means the struggle for control has already ended. Daniel thought he was sparring. Thought he was asserting experience over authority. What he didn't realize was that in trying to prove he understood the system better than anyone else, he had just signaled exactly how closely he was watching something no one else could see. The power struggle was over. And the bench had won without ever raising its voice. The change was immediate and it was unmistakable. Judge Judy stopped asking questions. The rhythm of the courtroom shifted in a way most people wouldn't consciously notice, but everyone felt. There were no more open-ended prompts, no invitations for explanation. The dialogue narrowed. What had been an exchange became a sequence of statements, precise, deliberate, and controlled. Daniel Mercer sensed it before he understood it. His posture stiffened further, his hands flattening against the table as if anchoring himself. The faint confidence that had carried him through the earlier moments began to falter, replaced by something sharper and less stable. He leaned forward again, then caught himself and leaned back, as though suddenly aware of his own body in a way he hadn't been before. Judge Judy looked down briefly, then back up. "We're going to pause for a moment," she said calmly. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. A pause in a courtroom like this wasn't procedural, it was strategic. She glanced toward the side of the room and made a small motion with her hand. A clerk stepped closer. Then a bailiff. Quietly. Without explanation. Daniel's eyes followed them. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Judge Judy didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she made another statement, not to him but to the room. "I want the record to reflect that the court has concerns unrelated to the merits of this dispute." Concerns. Plural. Unspecified. Daniel swallowed. He straightened again, his confidence no longer effortless but forced. "Your Honor," he began, "with respect, if there's an issue, I'd prefer we address it directly." Judge Judy looked at him steadily. "You will," she said. "In a moment." The audience didn't know what was happening. They didn't know where to look. There was no visible evidence. No object being held up. No accusation on the table. And that uncertainty filled the room like pressure building behind a door. Daniel started talking. He talked the way people do when silence feels dangerous. He clarified earlier statements. Revisited timelines. Reasserted intent. He repeated phrases he'd already used as if repetition could stabilize reality. "I've always conducted myself professionally. There was never any intent to intimidate. Everything I've done has been within the bounds of the law." His voice grew faster. His explanations longer. Judge Judy let him go on. She didn't interrupt when he drifted into legal theory. She didn't stop him when he began describing policies that had nothing to do with the case. She simply watched, the way someone watches a person walk confidently toward a door that hasn't yet been opened. Finally she spoke again. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "you're explaining things I didn't ask you to explain." Daniel hesitated. "I just want to make sure the court understands." "I understand," she replied, cutting him off for the first time. That interruption landed heavier than any raised voice could have. Daniel's mouth closed. His jaw tightened. He nodded once too sharply. Judge Judy continued, now speaking not as a participant in dialogue, but as the authority controlling the direction of events. "You've made it very clear that you are familiar with courtrooms," she said. "You've emphasized your experience, your background, your understanding of procedures." Daniel nodded again, more cautiously this time. "And because of that," she went on, "you should also understand that when someone begins offering explanations for issues that haven't been raised, it raises questions." Daniel's eyes flicked downward, then back up. "I'm not sure what you're implying," he said. "I'm not implying anything," Judge Judy replied evenly. "I'm observing." The clerk returned to her side. The bailiff remained nearby. Nothing visible had changed, and yet everything had. Daniel shifted his weight, his hands now gripping the edge of the table instead of resting on it. His earlier composure had cracked enough for urgency to leak through. "If there's some concern," he said, his voice tight, "I'd like to address it now." Judge Judy folded her hands. "You will," she said again. "But not by talking." That was the moment inevitability set in. The realization that whatever was unfolding no longer required his participation. That the narrative had moved beyond persuasion. Beyond confidence. Beyond experience. The audience still didn't know where the recording device was. They didn't know what had been captured. They didn't even know for certain that a recording existed. All they knew was that the judge knew something, and that Daniel Mercer was losing control of the only thing he believed protected him. His voice. He opened his mouth to speak again. "Mr. Mercer," Judge Judy said, her tone calm but final, "you've said enough." And for the first time since he walked into the courtroom, Daniel Mercer fell silent. Not because he chose to, but because the trap had closed around him, and he finally understood that whatever he thought he brought with him into that room was no longer going to save him. If at this moment you can feel that something is seriously wrong, you're not alone. This is the point where truth and lies are separated by a single step. Liking or subscribing to this video isn't just support. It's a signal that you stand with accountability, no matter how powerful the person involved may be. Because what's about to be revealed next, nothing after it will feel the same. Judge Judy didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She didn't dramatize what was about to happen. She simply looked at Daniel Mercer for a long, steady moment, the kind of pause that signals something irreversible is about to be said. "Mr. Mercer," she began, "you've spent a great deal of time today explaining how well you understand courtrooms." Daniel nodded cautiously, unsure whether that was praise or warning. So let's talk about something you should understand better than most, she continued. Recording. The word landed hard. Judge Judy didn't rush. She explained the law the way she always did, plainly, precisely, and without room for interpretation. Courtrooms, she said, are not public playgrounds. They are controlled legal environments. Recording devices are restricted. Consent matters. Authorization matters. And intent matters most of all. In many jurisdictions, she said, secretly recording a conversation without consent is a violation of the law. In a courtroom it's more serious, because it interferes with the administration of justice. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. And when the person doing the recording, she added, is someone trained in law enforcement, someone who knows these rules exist, that violation isn't accidental. It's intentional. That was when the air left the room. Judge Judy turned her head slightly and addressed the bailiff. Please retrieve the device. Daniel froze. For the first time his face stopped working. The micro-adjustments ceased. His hands didn't move. His eyes locked forward as the bailiff stepped toward him. Not aggressively, not hurried, but with certainty. The device was removed from a place no one in the audience had noticed. Small. Concealed. Ordinary looking. Until it wasn't. A quiet murmur rippled through the room. Judge Judy didn't hold it up. She didn't need to. This device, she said, was active. Daniel swallowed hard. It recorded this courtroom, she continued. It recorded me. It recorded court staff. And most importantly, it recorded you. Daniel's breath caught. Your Honor, I... She held up a hand. Silence returned instantly. This device didn't just capture audio, Judge Judy said. It captured intent. She explained what had been found, not in technical detail but in devastating clarity. Statements made before proceedings began. Comments muttered under breath. Remarks about getting something on tape. About having leverage. About protecting himself. Words spoken casually. Confidently. Never meant to be heard by anyone else. Except they were. The courtroom understood all at once. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't ignorance. This was a calculated decision made by someone who believed he was above the rules because he once enforced them. Daniel's face had gone pale. His mouth was slightly open but no sound came out. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He didn't even blink. Judge Judy leaned back slightly. You didn't record this courtroom to preserve truth, she said. You recorded it to protect yourself. She paused. And in doing so, you documented your own misconduct. The silence was absolute. Then she delivered the line, short, precise, and lethal. You didn't catch anyone doing something wrong, she said. You caught yourself. Daniel Mercer stood there, frozen, the weight of his own actions finally visible. No badge. No experience. No confidence left to hide behind. Just a man confronting the fact that the system he believed he could manipulate had, instead, recorded him doing exactly what he once punished others for. And there was no rewinding that. For several seconds, Daniel Mercer said nothing. His mind was clearly racing, trying to locate an exit that no longer existed. Then the collapse began, slowly at first like a structure failing one support at a time. That's not what this looks like, he finally said, his voice strained but controlled. I never intended for this to be improper. Denial. Immediate. Reflexive. Judge Judy didn't respond. She waited. Silence has a way of forcing people to keep talking, and Daniel fell straight into it. I mean, recording happens all the time, he continued. Body cams, dash cams, interview rooms, it's part of law enforcement training. Habit really? There it was. The first pivot. Training. He nodded as he spoke as if convincing himself. You don't even think about it after a while. You're trained to document everything. Protect yourself. Protect the truth. His words came faster now, overlapping slightly. The confidence was gone, replaced by urgency. This wasn't malicious, he insisted. It was an oversight. I didn't even realize the device was active in here. Judge Judy looked at him calmly, hands folded, eyes steady. You didn't realize, she repeated. Daniel seized on the opening. Exactly. Technology does that sometimes. Devices malfunction. Stay on when they shouldn't. It's not like I was trying to spy on anyone. Justification had turned into blame, not on himself but on the tool. Judge Judy waited until he finished. Then she spoke. "Mr. Mercer," she said evenly, "you told this court you were familiar with recording laws." "Yes, but..." "And you told this court you understood consent requirements." "Yes, but..." "And you told this court you had extensive experience testifying in legal proceedings." Daniel hesitated. "Yes." She leaned forward slightly, not aggressively but with focus. "Then you understand that training doesn't excuse violating the law. Oversight doesn't erase intent. And blaming technology doesn't absolve responsibility." Daniel's breathing became shallow. He tried again. "I wasn't trying to harm anyone," he said. "I was just covering myself." Panic had arrived. Judge Judy nodded once. "That," she said, "is exactly the problem." She explained it without emotion, without condemnation. Plain language. Simple cause and effect. "When a civilian secretly records a courtroom, it's serious," she said. "When a former police officer does it, it's worse. Because you don't get to claim ignorance. You don't get the benefit of the doubt." Daniel shook his head slowly. "This will ruin me." Judge Judy didn't flinch. "These are the consequences of your choices," she replied. "Not of this court." She continued, calmly outlining what would happen next. The recording would be preserved. The matter referred. Authorities would review it. His background would not shield him, it would be scrutinized. What he once believed made him untouchable now made the situation heavier. Daniel's shoulders sagged. His earlier posture, rigid, controlled, collapsed inward. His hands dropped from the table, fingers trembling slightly. "I spent my life enforcing the law," he said quietly. "I don't deserve this." Judge Judy's voice didn't change. "Then you should have respected it." The words landed with finality. Daniel said nothing after that. There was nothing left to say. No explanation that could undo what had already been captured. No justification that could erase intent. No badge to lean on. No authority to borrow. As he stood there, stripped of confidence and credibility, it became clear to everyone watching. This wasn't just the end of a case. It was the collapse of an identity built on the belief that power could substitute for accountability. And across from him sat Judge Judy, calm and unmoved, not because she enjoyed the fall, but because she understood something Daniel never did. The law doesn't care who you used to be. It only cares what you chose to do. Moments like this usually leave people with one of two feelings: relief that the law worked or anger that someone believed they were above it. Tell us in the comments, should people who once held authority be held to higher standards? And would you trust someone who records in secret instead of standing by their words under oath? If you believe accountability should be more than a word, if it should carry real consequences, stay with this video. What happened in that courtroom didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. In many ways it was only the beginning. The recording was preserved immediately. Not deleted. Not misplaced. Locked. Secured. Cataloged. What Daniel Mercer once believed was a private safeguard became an official piece of evidence. And once that happened, the case stopped being just a civil dispute. It became a question of professional conduct, legality, and trust. The matter was referred for review. Not quietly. Not informally. Formally. Because when a former police officer violates recording laws inside a courtroom, the issue doesn't stay contained. It ripples outward into every institution that once trusted him with authority. Every oath he swore was suddenly relevant again, and every standard he once enforced became the measure against which he would now be judged. One of the first consequences came swiftly: a review of his law enforcement credentials. Even though Daniel no longer wore the badge, his status as a former officer mattered. Certifications, training records, past conduct, all of it reopened. Licensing boards don't look kindly on violations that undermine the justice system itself, especially when the person involved knew better. Then came the department inquiry. Former colleagues were contacted. Supervisors interviewed. Records reviewed. Questions asked that Daniel had never imagined would be directed at him. Had he ever recorded without consent before? Had he ever used surveillance improperly? Had complaints been overlooked because of his position? The recording from the courtroom didn't just expose a single moment. It cast doubt backward, forcing scrutiny on an entire career. Employment consequences followed. Whatever professional opportunities Daniel still had, consulting work, security roles, expert testimony, evaporated almost overnight. No company wants to hire someone under investigation for secretly recording a judge. No legal team wants an expert whose credibility has been publicly dismantled. The same experience Daniel once wielded as leverage now became a liability. And then there was the reputation collapse. Courtroom footage doesn't stay in courtrooms anymore. It spreads. It's discussed, replayed, analyzed, commented on by people who don't care how many years you served, only how you behaved when accountability finally arrived. The narrative was brutal and unavoidable. A former cop caught violating the very laws he once enforced. Daniel tried to explain himself. To friends, to former colleagues, to anyone who would listen. He insisted it wasn't malicious, that it was misunderstood, that context mattered. But explanations don't carry much weight once trust is gone. And trust, once broken publicly, doesn't quietly rebuild. What made the consequences so severe wasn't just the act itself, it was the symbolism. This wasn't a civilian misunderstanding the rules. This was someone who knew exactly where the lines were and chose to cross them anyway. Someone who believed experience granted permission. Someone who assumed the system would bend because it always had before. That assumption proved fatal to his future. Because institutions survive on credibility. Courts, police departments, oversight boards. And when someone undermines that credibility from the inside, especially someone who once represented it, the response is never temporary. It's corrective. It's decisive. Daniel Mercer lost more than a case. He lost standing. He lost trust. He lost the narrative he had built around himself for decades. The idea that he was a protector, a professional, someone on the right side of the law by default. The damage didn't fade with time. It hardened. Became part of his record. Part of how his name would be remembered whenever it surfaced again. Not as a veteran officer. Not as an authority. But as a cautionary example of what happens when power is mistaken for immunity. And that's what made the outcome so satisfying for those watching. Not because someone fell, but because the system held. Because accountability didn't stop at the courtroom door. Because consequences didn't end with a ruling. Because the law didn't care who he used to be, only what he chose to do when it mattered most. For viewers who believe justice should follow people beyond the moment they're caught, this wasn't just resolution. It was validation. What this case ultimately exposed wasn't a loophole in the system. It was a mindset. The belief that power lasts forever. That experience replaces accountability. That once you've worn authority, you're entitled to bend the rules instead of follow them. Daniel Mercer didn't expose corruption. He didn't uncover misconduct. He didn't protect the truth. He documented his own willingness to violate the very principles he once claimed to defend. Because power on its own doesn't protect anyone. Integrity does. And integrity isn't something you can switch on when it's convenient. It's something that shows up in the moments when no one thinks they're being watched. In this case, the irony couldn't have been sharper. A man so confident in his understanding of the law failed to respect it. A man who believed he was above scrutiny created the most damaging evidence against himself. What made this moment resonate with millions wasn't just the reveal, it was the reminder that the law isn't impressed by resumes. It isn't intimidated by confidence. And it doesn't bend for people who assume it owes them loyalty. Sitting across from Judge Judy wasn't a performance and it wasn't a spectacle. It was a test. And Daniel failed at the moment he decided rules were for everyone else. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about accountability. About drawing a clear line and saying that trust, once broken, carries consequences. Especially for those who once demanded trust from others. The system didn't collapse here. It worked exactly as it was meant to. So now the question shifts to you. Should former officers be held to higher standards than civilians, given what they know and the power they once held? Would you trust someone who secretly records instead of standing behind their words under oath? And where should the line be drawn between experience and entitlement? Let me know what you think in the comments, because these are the questions that shape how justice is enforced long after the cameras stop rolling. And if this story left an impression on you, stay with us. Because next time, it isn't a former officer who learns this lesson the hard way, it's a politician's son who walks into court believing his last name will save him, only to discover that accountability doesn't recognize privilege either.